Lesson 9, economic crisis and panic. Oh my God!
Such an idiot. Right, okay. Well, you start, please.
So, what I'd like to sort of juxtapose this lesson against is the fact that in the United States you have these phenomenal case studies, okay, such as the case study of the cigarette. Here's a really good example of just unprecedented economic growth, boom like never before. In 1870, no cigarette industry as such. If you smoked cigarettes, you rolled your own cigarettes, you sort of leafed the tobacco, you could buy pouches of tobacco. Well, there's no cigarette industry. So if one wanted to smoke, you bought tobacco in bulk, you rolled it by hand, etc., etc. Now, in 1884, a man by the names of James Duke spotted a new invention in the state of Virginia, and it was invented by a teenager by the name of James Bonsack. Now, this machine could produce 120,000 neatly rolled cigarettes a day. Duke buys out Bonsack, realizing the potential of his invention, and goes into mass production. He is able to push the price of cigarettes down because he's mass producing them. He improves their quality, how quickly they smoke, and he manages to reduce the tax on tobacco. So with all of this and this brilliant sales and marketing and production, he signs incredible distribution deals with the railways. He gets direct links to tobacco growers, and he runs effectively his own supply chain. He creates an industry out of nothing to become the sort of the dominant cigarette man in the United States. And within a decade, he's selling 834 million cigarettes a year. He buys out all of his rivals, and by 1900, the American Tobacco Company had a monopoly of cigarette production across the United States. Duke himself was a millionaire hundreds of times over. And it is, your ultimate example of just unbridled wealth and potential of the American economy. However, this lesson is not about the good things. It's about the crises and panics. And it's an incredibly important thing to remember in your exams. Do not generalize about the Gilded Age. For everything good, there is something bad. Okay, so the economic growth was sort of one of the reasons the title earns the era earns the title the Gilded Age. The fact that there are frequent problems with agriculture, and not only that, the three major crises we're going to talk about today offset the good. Okay, and these crises we speak of today are known as the panics. We'll run you through the three major panics of 1873. So as I was saying, these economic crises known as panics, you get economic failure, corporate greed creates them, and terrible abuse of the system, which will lead to worker radicalization in the later part of the 19th century.
So we're going to look at three large panics, although there's actually many other ones, in particular one in 1869, although that wasn't so large. And there is a load of little depressions, little panics, and those are little, basically it's either going super up or super down. So these are only the big ones, but there's a wider instability. This is a banking crisis. So the way banks work is you give them money and as savings, and then you get your money back. They keep your money so you can't get robbed, and you get a bit of interest. Now, you may have wondered why do they get interest? Where do they get that money to give me an extra 1 or 2 or 3% on how much I give? Well, the answer is they don't keep your money in the bank. So what happens is, in America, there is no regulations, very little regulations of what bank can or cannot do with that money. If there's no rules about how much money they keep in their banks, there's really not many rules about what they do at all. The idea is, if you are a smart American, you know which is a good bank to put your money in, and it's up to you to decide, not the state. So what that means is there are over 80,000 banks across the country. Most of them are only one bank. There's not like HSBC with branches everywhere. All your money is in one particular bank. Now these banks, in reality, don't really have anything they can spend money on to make money, because what normally banks do is they take, say, Mr. Rain's $100. They say, I'll give you 2% interest on that, which means at the end of the year you would have $102. But with that $100 over the year, they might lend it to me, a farmer, to buy some new land and charge me an interest of 4%. So I borrow the $100, I pay that back, but I also pay back £4. So which the bank gives back Mr. Rain £102, which means the bank keeps that gap between the interest, which is £2. Do that on a mass scale and make a lot of money. However, most local banks don't have the skills and don't have the contacts and don't have the knowledge and don't have the opportunities to make those sort of profitable investments. What you want to do is you want to lend money to someone who pays it back quickly with a high rate of interest. So instead, they gave the money to New York banks. And so, for example, a bank in, say, Utah or Arizona or the Dakotas would send their money to New York, and the New York banks, who are far bigger and have the right contacts and also are able to invest pretty much anywhere in the US or the world, will then take all that money they're given and put it in a big bag and invest in a giant railway somewhere or a new business, a large business somewhere. Now, this was great if I'm the saver, I give my money to a bank in Delaware or a bank in South Dakota. They send that money to New York. New York lends that money to someone to make a railway. The railway does really well. The railway pays back their loan with loads of interest. New York keeps some of that interest. The rest of the money and the rest of the interest goes back to the local bank, and they give me my money back when I want it. The problem is, what happens if New York invests that money and then loses it all? And that's precisely what happened in 1873, where due to an unwise investment of lending $100 million to a guy called Jay Cook, who, it's not there, was a literal moron who had no idea what he was doing, and lost it all, and then kept half of it as well. Never got caught because no regulations about precisely whatever happened. His company goes bankrupt, which means if you are lending money as a New York bank to Cook, he doesn't have to pay you it back. There's a problem, because then they turn around to local banks and say, you know, that $100 of Mr. Rain's money, as well as many other people, yeah, we can't give that back because it's gone. Now, that's a problem. And what that this leads to a panic in which, if you know that there is the banks are short of money and that in reality they don't have your $100, you want to run to your bank, get out your money quicker before they run out of money. Because they have some money, they might have $1,000, but they've got 100 people who have all put in $100. So then the first one there to get their money out before the bank runs out of money gets their money back. So that causes a panic. The New York Stock Exchange also had to close. As a result, banks fail, companies fail, people run out of money, unemployment increases, and this can lead to a depression.
Okay, the Panic of 1893 and 1907. Again, just based on what Mr. Suter said, you probably already have or of the opinion that the U.S. banking system is unstable, and it very much is. Okay, this is not a system that's regulated, and there will be no regulation of the banking until the Glass-Steagall Act of the 1930s. Now, we are a long way away from there. So what happens in 1893 is, because of the instability of the banks, there are not that the bankruptcies were necessarily caused by bank instability, but because the banks had lent monies to railroads, and railroads start to run into problems. Now, there are too many railroads. There are not enough passengers. There are too many people who borrowed huge sums of money to start railroads and not enough profit. So as a result, railroads start going out of business. 1 in every 6 railroads, what goes into receivership, means that they're taken over by the banks. And as a result, the banks lose huge amounts of money because they're not going to be able to recover the huge amounts of money they lent to these railroads that are now bankrupt and out of business. So there's an acute lack of cash in the banks. As a result, banks stop lending. An industry who needs to borrow money so they can expand, borrow money to buy raw materials, cannot do it. They have to lay off thousands of workers to save costs, and unemployment jumps from 3.7 million to 12.3 million in 1894. That's a massive amount. That's the highest jump in unemployment of any period in U.S. history, even the Great Depression. Though the overall numbers are down, it is the highest jump. With no welfare state, of course, all of these people who have now lost their jobs face severe hardship. There are no benefits. There's no food kitchens. There is nothing to help these people. They are out of luck. The rich, in some cases, lose their savings and investments, but it's really the unemployed, the people, the working class, who face destitution in the Panic of 1893. It's really, really bad. The widespread poverty created by this economic crisis is actually another spur to the progressive thinking that we talked about last lesson. The idea that, they're starting to look at the ills of society, and a movement called progressivism, which aims at changing these ills, is starting to emerge. And the Panic of 1893, if you will, adds fuel to the fire of the progressive movement.
Now, the Panic of 1907 is basically the same thing, so you don't have to worry too much. You can look in your textbooks about specifics. Essentially, a large trust fails. Loads of banks had lent that large trust money. Therefore, those banks can't pay back their savers because all the money's gone, and therefore the banks fail. However, President Roosevelt, a progressive federal interventionist, slightly bigger government Republican, is on the case. And JP Morgan, a name you must be aware of at this point, also help. Because what happens is if companies fail because there's no money, if companies fail because there's not much demand, therefore reduces people their much they can sell, then it only gets worse and worse because they fire their workers and so on and so on. It's a spiral. However, they put rules in place and JP Morgan bails out the government, lends loads of money to help keep demand high by stimulating the economy. This is the most common way we deal with economic crises now, is by pouring money through either decreasing taxes, increasing spending, printing more money, or buying out or paying for businesses which are about to fail so they don't fail, and therefore stop the crisis becoming a forward depression. However, again, the fact that this happened showed the fragility of the financial system.
So just to recap, how do panics get out of control? Number one, they happen for a combination of reasons. You've got economic reasons, financial reasons, political reasons, and even psychological reasons. We'll go over this in a little bit. Usually all panics start with a run on the banks. Once people realize there's an economic crisis, they go to the banks to withdraw their money. As a result, banks with no money face a lack of cash. People start to believe that the banks had lent too much money and their savings might be vulnerable, and the banks they're really put between a rock and a hard place. This leads to collective panic. People withdraw their funds. Panics usually occur after a period of rapid economic growth and increased bank lending. But what happens to American banks in the late 19th century is they're not strong enough to survive the collective withdrawal of funds. They do not have large cash reserves. There are too many American banks, and as a result, not any bank holds a central huge wad of cash that they can survive a whole whack of people wanting all of their money out at the same time. Banks use your money. It just doesn't sit there. Okay. The federal system in the United States is a massive underlying factor. The fact that it encourages panics and it discourages the development of national or regional banks. It encourages panics through the lack of regulation. The fact that people really truly believe that anything can happen, good or bad, and when they start to believe things are bad, they start to panic and money gets poured out. Now, also too, they also encourage anyone, and they will give a license to anybody who wants to start a bank. So you get these small podunk towns in the middle of nowhere, and the person with the most money starts a bank because it seems like a good way of making money. But in the middle of a crisis, if he lends unwisely, everybody in that town loses their money. So, of course, the only intervention at all is when they start to borrow money from JP Morgan and dump money into the markets and lend money to the banks so that they can allow people to withdraw it. And that happens in 1907.
So what are the reasons for this? Well, I'm primarily looking at the financial and economic ones. Partly, when you have a period of rapid growth, there's lots of confidence and the market is buoyant, as we described. What that means is banks are optimistic. Banks think they can lend money to risky and riskier businesses, more and more businesses to make more money. And then there's more money made. That means there's more money to lend and there's more and more lending. Banks in particular, particularly the big New York ones, like lending to trusts because they are so big, because that means they have lots of cash reserves, because that means they are in theory led by people who know what they're doing, because they have a virtual monopoly, it is believed that they cannot fail. So therefore, banks put loads of money, buy loads of shares of large trusts. When these trusts fail, the bank can lend the money, but in American law, if you go bankrupt, you do not have to pay your debt, people who you owe money to, who you borrowed money to, at anything, if at all, or maybe at least a little bit, maximum a little bit. So therefore, the people who invest their money in the banks, in turn, don't get their money back. And that leads to a sort of psychological thing, as we see in a second, where at the slightest sign that things are going wrong, people take their money out of banks, which then only makes the problem worse, because banks can, if everyone asks for their money at the same time from a bank, they've lent some of it out. Even if it's on a good loan, they cannot pay that back, and then the bank itself goes bankrupt, even if there is not a problem. The other factors relate to this. This is more about the rules and nature of lending as opposed to just general economic things. As mentioned, there are loads of banks. Most of them are too small to actually be able to weather too many people trying to take all their money out at the same time. And they also relied on New York bankers to borrow money and lend money and in order to keep going. This means that if one or two New York banks fail, it affects banks all over the country which has lent money to them. Many of these New York banks, because there's no regulation on who can become a banker, any idiot can do it and they might lend unwisely. Because there's no regulation of how much of your money you can give to the New York bankers, many banks gave 100%, which means as soon as something goes wrong and people start asking for their money back, they can't pay it because it's in New York. And because there's not much regulation, the New York banks can do whatever they want without having to worry about keeping some on the side just in case things go wrong. And they take very high risks and invest unwisely, which means as soon as there's a problem, as soon as either the amount of money lent out disappears because a company goes bankrupt, or loads of people start asking for money, there's no money in between. There's no contingency cash in order to pay them off with, and so the bank has to go bankrupt.
Okay, the last things are the political reasons. Alluded to this a few slides ago. The federal system in the United States is a massive underlying factor here. Probably not the reason for the panics, but certainly it is a connective thread. It encourages panics in the sense that it discourages, as I said, the development of regional and national banks. Okay, it fears intervention and only does it once in the Panic of 1907. There is no regulation. There is no control over the bank, and anyone with enough money could set up a bank, operate independently, and have absolutely no oversight. Many people do that. There are 80,000 banks in the United States in the late 19th century, and if you think of Britain right now, you're probably thinking there's probably no more than 10, and you'd be right. Okay, there are 80,000 banks in the United States. Most of these banks are unstable. All of these banks are lending, and many of them are doing it poorly. Therefore, people's savings are not secure in the United States at all. This has a massive impact on the psychology of the people who put their money in banks. And you're thinking, why don't you put it under your bed? Well, there's not very many police either, so they're not going to help you out very much if someone robs you blind. So you're better safer in a bank, even though it's not safe at all. So the whole thing has a huge psychological impact. Okay, any sign of trouble, there is always a run on the bank. People believe when banks had lent too much money, they will pull their money out. Collective panic sets in. Because if I know anything about human nature and watching students run around to school, when one person is worried, everybody is worried, and collective panic sets in. I mean, if I'm asking a question at GCSE or I'm asking a question at A level, it is absolutely the same no matter who does it. People will withdraw their funds. Panics occur after a period of rapid economic growth based on increased bank lending. And these are the reasons. So what we've done here, Mr. Studer and I have put them into 4 broad categories, which can be used very effectively to answer questions in an essay.
Really well done, us.
Yeah.
Particularly Mr. Rain, who wrote this.
Very good. Yes, we are really something.
High five.
Hey.